Without further ado, I would like to introduce our next moderator. Bill Mobley is a co-director of CCARE and has really been a partner in this endeavor from its beginnings and has been extraordinarily supportive. Bill is the Cahill Family Professor of Neurology, the former department chair for neurology and neurological sciences at Stanford, as well as the former director of the Stanford Neuroscience Institute. His area of research as a neuroscientist is in the field of Down syndrome and Alzheimer's, for which he's won a number of awards. And it's with my great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Mobley, my friend, and I appreciate his being with us here today. Thanks, buddy.
So great start to this meeting, and let's continue that energy. The moderator's job is to keep people on time, and so when I completely ignore your hand at the end of the question period, please be compassionate toward me. Maybe heroic compassion won't be necessary, but just a little compassion. So let's get started with Wendy Farley. Wendy comes to us from the Religious Studies Department at Emory University, and Wendy, thank you for being here.
I appreciate you all inviting me here. I kind of feel like at the beginning of Monty Python, they used to say, and now for something completely different. So that's what we're going to do now. I feel like I'm kind of parachuting into a conversation that I don't know very much about. I'm a theologian primarily, and so we talk about things differently. And I wanted to give a sense of the range of ways Christians thought about compassion. And I should emphasize, when I say Christians, I'm really thinking about from the contemplative perspective of Christianity, not TV evangelists, for example. So I'm going to start by giving two sort of snapshots of images of compassion in the Christian tradition, and then spend most of my time talking about, from a Christian point of view, a paradox of our condition, and then just conclude by almost listing some of the practices Christians engage in to increase compassion. The deep root of compassion for Christians is the gospel, which is the portraits of Jesus. Now, Jesus is somebody who is portrayed as awakening compassion as the basic principle of reality. To awaken to compassion is a kind of radical turning around in the Gospels. And Jesus of Nazareth conveys that in a couple of different ways. One, by what he does. And one of the things he does is have a kind of supernatural indifference to class, gender, education, who you are. It's like he just can't see social cues. The other thing that he does to convey this sense of compassion is to tell parables. He tells these really odd little stories. And I'm going to tell you one of them. It's the end of time, and Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats. And the sheep are surprised to find themselves going to heaven. And they say, how come we get to go to heaven? And Jesus says, because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was sick, you came to me. And they said, we've never seen you before. This is really looking a gift horse in the mouth, but nonetheless. And he said, whenever you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. I take this to be the central insight of Christianity, that to see in the afflicted and the despised of the earth, Jesus, that is to say, for a Christian, that means to see every human being as a God-bearer is to be in heaven. And not to do that is to be in hell. So we are collectively in hell together. And what the Christian message is to wake up to the heaven that is around us all the time. The other little vignette or picture of compassion I'm going to share with you is from Julian of Norwich, a 14th century contemplative. Her story is very interesting, but I won't tell it to you. She describes She's meditating on the face of Christ in his crucifixion. And she describes it both as utterly, horrifically contorted by agony and the most beautiful face in the world. For Julian, Jesus' face is the most beautiful in the world because it's the identity, it's the simultaneity of human beings in our long crucifixion and the divine compassion. And for her, that's the basic reality. And that in her writings, that's what she's trying to convey to those who read her. Her writings were mostly destroyed, but she's somebody who was, she was an anchoress. She could see the Lollards burned from where she was, and she could see the plague victims' bodies thrown in the pits. So she's not somebody who doesn't know about suffering. And so for her, it was the way in which divine compassion enters into that horrific suffering, which is the most important reality. Now, those are the two kind of images of compassion in my tradition. And there is, unfortunately, the fact that this radical compassion runs up against the hard truth that we humans remain largely dead to one another's suffering. And Christianity, Christian theology, is preoccupied with what it takes to be the central paradox of the human condition. To put it in theological language, we are made in the divine image, and therefore love and compassion are our natural states. But we are addicted to fears and pleasures that cloud our minds with unreality. What is most natural to us ontologically is most foreign to us experientially. I would say that contemporary theology is very much influenced by and appreciative of evolution and child development and so on, and appreciate how this enriches and complicates our understanding of the human condition. But from a theological point of view, they don't solve the paradox of our existential situation. Christians understand human beings to be rational in the sense that human beings are capable of reality. We're capable of being aware of reality. Reason is a virtue. That is to say, we attain it by training. Babies, I really hate to say this to a bunch of scientists, but babies' minds, this is based on watching my own kids learn to see things, but babies' minds are trained to see objects from a kind of mishmash of colors and patterns. And we train our children's minds to understand algebra and poetry and family dynamics. From a Christian point of view, the ineradicable dignity of human beings and the poignancy of our suffering is just as real as objects and poetry and algebra and family dynamics. But we don't perceive them in the same way. We remain in a kind of dark ignorance. Compassion, from our point of view, it expresses a basic reality orientation, and its absence indicates a distortion of our capacity for truth. It's a species of self-deception. For example, if we believe that Jewish people are vermin and must be eradicated, or that because women are not capable of genuine spiritual accomplishments, they should be barred from education, the primary problem here is not a cognitive error. These kinds of self-deceptions are impervious to facts because they are not about facts. Thomas Aquinas used the term invincible ignorance to describe the way in which mind can be sealed off from reality. In this kind of ignorance, the problem is that prior to any specific cognition or emotion, our capacity for rationality has been shredded. Prior to any particular thought or feeling, the structure of mind has been shaped in such a way that reality is not fully accessible to us. It's like being very drunk or delirious. We have thoughts, we have emotions, but they are disconnected from reality. There's something horrifying about this invincibility. A human being faces you, their innate preciousness and beauty, the terrible defacement of their suffering as immediate as the color of their hair, and yet one is incapable of perceiving it. The awareness of compassion is not factual awareness. A torturer is able to perceive suffering. The great mystery of human existence is that we are capable of seeing color and doing multiplication tables, but the most raw and immediate truths of our existence remain obscure to us. For those of us trapped in this invincible ignorance, there is no exit, no simple way of returning to reality. And yet this nightmarish insanity is our normal condition. It is our condition not as a cognitive error or as an isolated emotion. It is our condition in the sense that this ignorance structures our basic access to reality. These irrationalities structure not only how individuals perceive one another, but how we construct social institutions. That much of the world lives in poverty, that 1 in 15 Black men spends time in prison, that we exploit the earth and seek our happiness in concentration of wealth. In short, that we are constantly defrauded of our common humanity is not only tolerable, but completely normal. Abraham Heschel puts this in his book about the Hebrew prophets. The exploitation of the poor is to us a misdemeanor. To God, it is a disaster. The structuring of mind by ignorance prior to any particular thought or emotion means that the capacities that shape our access to reality are mostly hidden from us and not accessible to direct control. Even if we become convinced that racism is wrong, we cannot simply experience reality differently through a simple act of the will. We might wish to be more compassionate, but that wish does not ignite our heart with love for strangers. More adequate access to reality requires that the habit of spiritual blindness be healed, and it is this healing of a spiritual wound to which practices of compassion and contemplation are addressed. Contemplative practice operates in the liminal space between conscious and preconscious dimensions of mind. It is in this preconscious zone of mind that obstacles to compassion must be dismantled. Both egocentrism that is indifferent to suffering and egocentrism overwhelmed by suffering, which I believe is which is in a sense what you were talking about. Both of these make compassion very difficult. From a Christian point of view, when the ego becomes decentered and rests in non-duality with the beloved, both kinds of obstacles dissipate. Contemplative practice aims at this kind of union, which produces love and compassion as its natural fruit. Much classical religious writing is dedicated to the problem of generating compassion, assuming that compassion is difficult because feelings of pride, anger, and jealousy dominate awareness. These writings propose ways of modifying the ego so that the claims of something other than oneself might make some headway. One kind of rhetoric that has been used to describe this is dying to self, self-sacrifice, self-emptying. This language and the practices related to it expose ways in which a certain kind of egocentrism functions to block love and compassion. But another problem is that the intensity and scope of suffering is too excruciating. Mothers, social workers, pastors, healthcare workers, teachers often suffer a kind of spiritual maiming because they are overwhelmed physically and spiritually by the relentlessness of suffering. Traditional language of patience, self-sacrifice, dying to self may be helpful in situations where compassion is not easily generated, but it can become toxic when directed to a situation when compassion is already a kind of internal bleeding. In these situations, practice is necessary to make compassion more skillful and less self-destructive. The important point here is that the causes of suffering and the obstacles to compassion are diverse, and a variety of interpretations and practices are necessary. I'm going to mention a few practices that are current in contemporary Christianity. Centering prayer may be the most concrete example of Christian meditation. It's rooted in an ancient Christian practice that's described by an anonymous 14th century text, The Cloud of Unknowing. It was reformulated by Trappist monks who were prodded by the success of their Buddhist neighbors into finding a way to make Christian contemplation more available to lay people. As a technique, it's the effort to bring attention to a single point, typically a sacred word. As contemplation, it is an existential posture through which pre-conscious intimacy with the divine is nourished. It reflects the Christian view that our natural state is union with humanity, between humanity and divinity, and it employs a simple meditative technique to draw this reality into more stable awareness. Christians also practice at least two kinds of mindfulness. Mindfulness, I don't think, is a word I'm familiar with in the Christian tradition, but I think it describes these practices. One practice is rooted in, was used by the desert ascetics that beginning in the 4th century. The core of this practice is to watch your mind all the time, every day, all the time, not as a separate practice, but as a accompaniment to all practice. Watch your mind and watch what they called passions arise, and work with the negative passions as soon as you saw them. They understood the passions. Emotion is a modern word. It wasn't really part of the Christian anthropology until, the 16th or 17th century. But anyway, so they used the word passion, and they understood it to have a very deep root. And if you noticed it as it appeared, you could work it so that deep root could be pulled. They used the metaphor of uprooting a tree. And they said, if you get anger and you're just a little anger, if it's a small tree, it's easy to get up. It gets to be a great big tree, it's a real problem to get up. But working the mind, watching the mind constantly was their primary practice. And they understood that watching the mind gave you a kind of access to those things that you don't have immediate access to. So it's a practice for unearthing what you don't have immediate access to. That may not be clear, but anyway, moving on. The other kind of mindfulness is sometimes called the sacrament of the present moment. And this isn't only watching your own mind, but it's a practice of integrating into experience, every single experience, constantly, all day long, a contemplative disposition. In every event, in every person, the fullness of the Godhead is made available to you. This is a way of integrating whatever happens into your sense of intimacy with the divine. As Teresa of Avila puts it, God is also in the pots and pans. I don't think there's lots of different ways of talking about Christian meditation, and we can talk more about that if you want to. But it occurred to me as I was thinking about this that to understand Christian practices of compassion, meditation is probably not the most obvious example. For many Christians, response to suffering is completely ordinary, like washing your hands when they're dirty. And it's how you raise your children, it's volunteering at a homeless shelter, it's organizing against the death penalty, it's protesting a war or racial segregation, it's starting a support group, it's taking dinner to somebody who had a baby, and so on. So Christians of almost every political stripe and denomination think of practical aid to other people as an integral part of their faith. And partly because of the Bible's prophetic tradition, many Christians are sensitive to ways social, economic, and religious structures cause suffering, and therefore they target social causes of suffering. Most of the progressive movements in this country, abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights, are rooted in Christian practices. Now, you probably know that Christians do not agree on what those social structures should look like. Homophobia, slavery, patriarchy, these are also Christian practices, as you probably know. But the point is that Christians think of the social causes of suffering as a place to work compassion. And they think of the formation of compassion and social responsibility as a very significant part of their youth program, whether you're trick-or-treating for UNICEF or going on a mission trip. Those practices are very integral to Christian life. The other nearly universal Christian practice is intercessory prayer. This, I think, I've begun to think of this as a parallel to Buddhist compassion meditation. Because in intercessory prayer, you extend your awareness to pockets of humanity that you don't normally know or care about. You think about the poor, refugees, soldiers, prisoners, those who mourn, peacemakers, and your mind goes out to them, and your mind goes out wishing good for them. So that in that practice of prayer, you're really visualizing a kind of robust goodness that cannot be overcome by suffering or injustice. And you wish or intend or call down that goodness for all of humanity. All of these practices are ways of transforming a part of us that is not directly accessible to will or cognition or emotion, so that we can become more awake to the poignancy of suffering and better incarnate love and compassion in the midst of that suffering. From a Christian point of view, the deepest reality is unconditional and unending love. And from this perspective, altruism and compassion, delight in the happiness of others and sorrow for their suffering, charity, justice, solidarity, are all splinters of that basic reality. That's all I had to say by way of introducing the idea of Christianity and compassion. Happy to take questions.
I am a Christian, and so I wasn't surprised to hear what you said, but there's this complete acceptance of our blindness, right? And when you go into it, I was starting to feel pretty negative about the whole thing. I mean, is that really me? Am I really so blind? I probably am, but the whole conception is I'm meant to be deeply in love with life, and yet I'm blind. And that's true. I have trouble believing the brain is fundamentally a bad organ. And my sense is that this negativity, this evil that exists within my soul, if you call it that way, in fact, is a natural response to the world in which I live. So you were then bringing up the notion of compassion that's skillful compassion, not a compassion that reaches out to help and gets slaughtered in the process, but rather one that reaches out appropriately and protects the other while protecting oneself. That's the sense I got from this sort of more skillful compassion that Christians are aiming for. So could you say something about that? And also, could you say why I feel so bad about myself as a Christian?
It's all those Presbyterians in my bloodline. I can't help that. I think it's true that I think of Christianity as having this like double vision, this really, really high, optimistic, beautiful sense of human beings as totally capable of radical compassion. And because they have that sense of that, it's really discouraging to see how we actually function in the world. And I think that the notion that we have, basically we often function fairly well in families and smaller communities, and the broader we get out, the more difficult it is. So Christianity has a kind of sadness, I think, about the world. And
sort of millions and millions of personal failures.
Well, if you put your mind to the suffering of, I was really shaken up, frankly, by your film. Thanks a lot. So, you go into that one story of that family, and it's very painful. And then you think about millions and billions of people suffering, and it's quite overwhelming. And so I think Christians have a sense that that's not right, that it shouldn't be that way. We should be able to respond to one another much more compassionately, and so there's a kind of the pessimism is that kind of frustration, I think, combined with a very high ideal of what we're capable of. So you can kind of look at it as very depressing or very optimistic. And And that's why I think religious practice is really helpful, because it just kind of keeps you in the space of, well, we're working on this, kind of, that it's not appropriate to despair, but we have some work to do. So it's those mixed, and in terms of the skillfulness, I became aware that the tradition I was reading about really presupposed the situation of men with anger problems, and monastic men with anger problems was the paradigm, and it was very wise. It was a very wise tradition, but my mother was a social worker, and I just watched her get shredded by not being skillful, and those materials were not helpful for her to figure out how to be a better social worker. And so part of what the contemplative tradition does is it's very, I think of it as very skillful and very concrete. So whatever the obstacle is, it wants to focus on that. So these traditions, they had teachers, they had particular spiritual directors, not kind of Kantian universal principles. Because what works for me or what is a problem for me is quite different from somebody else. So the skillfulness is working with your own mind, given your wounds, your blocks, your problems, the way your mind's going to, what rabbit hole your mind's going to fall down. So it's very specific in that way.
Thank you, Wendy. So one of the things I'm trying to work towards in my life is I want to work towards a world where contemplative practices is widespread everywhere and taken for granted. Like everybody spends time meditating, everybody thinks of compassion and kindness like every day, it has mindfulness all the time and so on. And so my question to you is, what needs to happen for that to be true for the Christian community?
I think I have two opposite things to say. One is, I don't believe there's one thing that works for everybody. I think that the human race is the same in that we're all human, and we're all different, and that we're human differently. So that an ideal where we were all doing the same thing doesn't make sense to me exactly. Nonetheless, I do think that we're in a time when there's been a reaction against contemplative practice in the modern world. Science, bless your heart, you're part of that, I'm afraid. And now but that's kind of coming back around. And that's why I appreciate this meeting, because it's giving to a religious practice the scientific justification, I suppose. And it's true that that's the apologetic voice in our culture. But I do think that the tradition, I mean, even from the time I was a little girl to now, in the Presbyterian church, I don't actually go to a Presbyterian church very often, but that is my background. They are beginning to incorporate more contemplative practices, and you just see it popping around all over the place. I think we are in a time when that's developing more. So I don't anticipate that will be every day. The other thing is to appreciate that they do practices that we don't. My sister is the coalition chair for the Tennesseans Against the Death Penalty. She wouldn't meditate in 100 years, I'm betting. And it would be really good for her. But I say, you go, girl. You go visit the prisoner. You work against the death penalty. We're not going to all do the same thing. And to appreciate the different kinds of practices that are useful, I think, is a good thing.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thanks.
that. Very good. Great pleasure now to introduce Geshe Thupten Jinpa. He's just a great guy. He has been such a stimulus to us, such a guide, such a mentor for creating CCARE and moving it forward. He was educated at the Shartse College of Gandhin Monastic University, South India. I wish we had institutions called that in America. Imagine the Stanford College of Gandhin Monastic University. Wouldn't that be great? It's incredible. But we're not going to get that right away. So anyway, he was educated in India, received his Geshe Laram degree there, then went on to get a bachelor's in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies from Cambridge University, and taught at Gandhin Monastery, where he worked as a research fellow. He is, I think, most well known and highly regarded as an English translator for the Dalai Lama. Please read the books that he has helped write with and interpret for the Dalai Lama. The Universe in a Single Atom is my favorite. It's a beautiful book and makes really the possibility of this bridging between science and Buddhist contemplatives much more possible than otherwise it would have been. He's now adjunct professor at the Faculty of Religious Studies at McGill, and he's also a visiting faculty member here at Stanford. He is really responsible principally for the massive collection called the Library of Tibetan Classics, and we're so pleased to have you, Jimpa. You honor us.
Thank you, Bill. As I was preparing for this conference, I thought about in what way can the interface of Buddhist tradition with modern science and Western philosophy can be seen as fruitful. And so given that the focus of our conference here is looking really at the definitional issues, I thought perhaps I can look at two particular aspects that the Buddhist tradition brings to this kind of discussion. One is that, as some of you are aware, that Buddhist tradition has historically been very interested in, what one could call mental cultivation. In fact, the technical term for which is translated as meditation in English, the Sanskrit term is bhavana, and bhavana really literally means cultivation. And the idea is the cultivation of a certain way of seeing things, cultivation of a way of being, and cultivation of a habit. So, of course, unfortunately now the term meditation has been popularly appropriated, and every time someone uses that term, everybody has its own take on this. But I just want everybody here to be mindful of where the traditional kind of understanding of this term, bhavana, is coming from. So that is one area where Buddhism has a very long history of development and cultivation and refinement and so on. The other area where Buddhism has also been quite remarkably successful is kind of a philosophical reflection, critical reflection on the content of these various states that are the aim of these mental cultivation practices, and also an attempt to understand the interconnections between the various concepts. So in that sense, there is a kind of a not just an application of an introspective processes, but also a kind of a post-introspection reflection upon the experiences and the mental states that have been cultivated. So what I thought I could do here is to give a brief kind of, a deconstruction of a particular form of compassion cultivation practice that is standard in Tibetan tradition. Of course, as Wendy pointed out, that not one thing works for everybody, which is also the same in the Buddhist tradition. In fact, you will notice that once you get more familiar with the Buddhist tradition, there's a whole multiplicity of contemplative practices, even with regard to compassion cultivation. In fact, for example, in many of the traditional Buddhist countries, majority of the people don't meditate. I mean, in the West, people tend to think that all the Buddhists, everybody meditates. It's a very small percentage of traditional Buddhists who actually meditate. Then the question is, how do the majority actually cultivate these qualities? So in the case of average layperson, a villager, the way in which they will approach the cultivation of compassion will be through a kind of a devotional approach, where they will kind of, evoke the myth of the Buddha of compassion, chant the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, and have examples like His Holiness, who is seen as the physical embodiment of the qualities that the Buddha of compassion represents. So it's a powerful combination of chanting, invoking of a certain myth of Buddha of compassion with the historical reality of a living person who exemplifies this. These qualities are cultivate them. There is no formal sitting. There is no silent meditation. So on the other hand, you have monastic members, some of whom may dedicate hours of their life into silent formal sitting. Then there will be a much more systematic approach to cultivation of compassion. So what I will do is I will look at one of the standard practices and try to tease out what are the specific cognitive and affective states these practices are aiming to cultivate, and how do they relate to the topics of our interest here, which is compassion and altruism. And also, one advantage for scientists and philosophers to engage with Buddhism is that in engaging with Buddhism, you are confronted with a tradition that has quite an independent lineage of history of intellectual thinking and philosophical tradition. So therefore, where we can see areas of convergence that could be seen as kind of quite a powerful confirmation of moving in the right direction, and where we see divergences may also point out an interesting point of contrast and reference. And one of the things that are salient questions that I would like to raise from my presentation is to really throw out here in open discussion whether we have at this point adequate conceptual tools to fully understand the phenomenon that we are studying. I'm aware that coining the term empathy at the turn of the 20th century really made a significant difference in making, giving the scientist at least a kind of a handle on compassion and altruism. But if you think about historically, 20th century is very recent. So similarly, as we are exposed to an intellectual tradition like Buddhist contemplative practices, then there might be, at least in principle, a possibility that the conceptual framework may open up, which may then allow us to think outside the box and have a much more complex kind of tools, conceptual tools to look at these phenomena. Just some basic, and my apologies for not being able to scroll down. I'm very new to the PowerPoint kind of technology, so at least I was able to get it on the screen. So few basic points to remember when we talk about kind of the concept of Buddhism, a concept of compassion in Buddhism. The capacity to feel for others' suffering is an inborn quality. And which tend to express more naturally towards someone that we love. And Paul talked about familial compassion, so that's a reference to that one. This capacity is intimately connected with our basic nature as sentient creatures, and the key aspect of that really is our natural disposition to seek happiness, aspire to happiness, and the wish to overcome suffering. So that's really our basic sentient nature. And in fact, in the Buddhist tradition, sentient being is defined in terms of the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. Then another point, through deliberate cultivation, we can learn to feel compassion for a much wider circle of concern than we normally do in our natural setting. So the idea that it can be, the idea is expanding circles of our concern. And the heart of such cultivation practices must include developing sensitivity to others' suffering, a cognitive process that seeks to make one feel deeply connected with this wide circle of beings, and learning to wish to see them relieved of their suffering. So although in the natural kind of setting we feel all of this, instinctively towards someone that we care, but when we try to cultivate beyond the normal circle, then we have to somehow learn to do this. And then the highest form of compassion transcends all boundaries and embraces all sentient beings within its sphere. So an interesting thing is that if you look at the actual kind of trajectory of the cultivation process, what is happening is that you begin from a very concrete reality of a familial compassion, where the unconditional concern of a mother to her infant child is really the model, which is very concrete and real, but has a very strong self-reference as well, because it's your child. Then you expand it towards your friends and your, village members and so on. But what the interesting thing is, as compassion is cultivated and it becomes more and more kind of advanced, the reference to self gets less and less, and at some point, the reference to self gets completely transcended. So that really is the idea in this. So now, how is compassion defined in Buddhism? Now here we have to be mindful, because when I'm using terms like compassion, altruism, sympathy, and so on, I'm using English terms. But I'm using English terms to translate Sanskrit or Tibetan terms, which has its own kind of roots in the tradition. So compassion, which is the English equivalent of karuna, is a mental state. And you can see that it has got three key components. It's endowed with a sense of concern, and this is anukampa or jesutsewa. This is really seen as the natural love, a natural kind of quality of the mind to be able to feel concern. And then it focuses on another being, so there is that cognitive component of, viewing someone suffering, and then wishes for that being to be relieved of suffering. So there is a motivational component. So already it's quite a complex state. In a natural setting, although it arises spontaneously, but in itself it's already a complex state of mind. So you can see an affective component, which is the feeling of concern, and a cognitive component, which is focused on other suffering, and a motivational component, which is to wish to see that suffering be relieved. Now, although in the cultivation practices, you cultivate this towards all beings, and while you are cultivating, it is a very contrived, simulated state of mind, because you're using thought processes. But when the compassion arises, it is always spontaneous. And the feeling component is the most dominant. It's a sense of concern, really is the way in which compassion is expressed. So this is how compassion is understood and defined in the Buddhist tradition. And here there will be no difference between the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition. The Mahayana tradition is the tradition that is dominant in China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, and so on. And Theravada is the Buddhist tradition that is dominant in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, and so on. Now, what are the kind of key elements in a standard practice of cultivating compassion, say? And through CCARE, we have created a compassion cultivation protocol, an 8-week program, which is right now being used, and Jeannie and her team is studying the effects of this. So now I'm not going to go into the detail. I'll just give you a kind of a snapshot of what's happening in this process. So what you have is cultivating a deeper sensitivity to an understanding of the nature of suffering, especially its causal dynamics, first in relation to one's own experience. Now, there is a recognition in Buddhism, the Buddhist tradition, that when you are confronted with the acute physical pain, compassion will arise naturally, because the sight of the acute pain is so powerful that it creates the connection very immediately. But if the problem of the other person is more of a psychological nature, then it's less visible. And the less visible the problem is, the more cognitive processes you need to use, because you need to have some awareness of the psychological processes. So that's for some degree of emotional awareness is needed to be able to really feel deep concern for others. And then another element is cultivating equanimity. Equanimity is probably not the right word, but anyway, the Sanskrit term is upeksha, especially the recognition of the fundamental equality of self and others insofar as the basic disposition to wish for happiness and the wish for overcoming of suffering is concerned. So here, and reading Monroe's, Paul referred to Christian Monroe's work, and one thing that really struck me was how many of these heroic altruists, as she calls them, a true altruist, as she called them, the one common kind of remark they all made was their shared sense of humanity. It was just, there is another human being. And so this is, in fact, what is being aimed at here, to really establish this connection where you recognize that just as I wish for happiness and I do not wish to suffer, the other too does not wish to suffer and wish to achieve happiness. And then the next element is, now this is more tricky, it's cultivating Yong, and this is a difficult term to translate in English, and this is perhaps one concept that is maybe missing in the current discourse on the whole psychology of empathy and compassion. And the idea here is a perception of others as dear. And literally the Yong means the other, you perceiving the other as appealing to your mind. So it's a kind of an opposite reaction to an aversion. So if you feel averse to the other, you're not going to feel connected and you're not going to feel compassion. So like one of the key elements of the practice is to cultivate this Yong. Now it's very difficult to translate. I know that my colleague Alan Wallace translates this as affectionate love, but I'm not happy with that term. But Yong literally means perceiving the other as appealing to my mind. Yeah. So in other words, not aversive. And so, and the point here, and the term Yong is also etymologically, both in Sanskrit and in Tibetan, connected with the term attractive, someone that you feel attracted to and appealing, to your mind. And this is kind of a difficult concept. So now, once you have these, then the basis is established for a genuine sense of concern to arise for the other. Since this Yong or manapi or Sanskrit term is so crucial, we can see that it is a complex, state in itself. So you have, for example, cultivating a deep sense of inner connectedness and identification with the other. So the interconnectedness with the other and identification with the other is an important condition for that. Another condition is a kind of a sense of gratitude to the other. So these are the two important elements of the practice that is supposed to give rise to this Yong state. And then you have, of course, the actual cultivation of compassion, so once you have cultivated this Yong, and then the next step is to simply reflect on others' suffering, and then compassion is supposed to arise. So, and then in the practice, and the compassion is reinforced by a more active form of compassion called Tonglen, which involves visualization of taking up on others' suffering and offering one's happiness and joy to others. So with relation to this Yong, there's a beautiful quote from Tsongkhapa, which I will read. And this is from one of his major works. He says, and I quote, "Now, when one sees suffering in one's enemy, not only is there no sense of unbearableness, but there is in its place a feeling of joy. And when one sees someone who has done neither benefit nor harm to you suffer, most of the time one tends to be oblivious to this. This happens because one lacks on one's part a sense of holding them as dear. With relation to one's kin, when one sees their suffering, one is unable to bear this, and furthermore, the greater the depth of one's sense of holding them dear, the more intense one's feeling of unbearableness appears to be. So the need to generate this Yong towards sentient beings, valuing them dearly and cherishing them in one's heart is a most critical point." So this is where the crux of the actual practice is supposed to be. And you can see that the empathy, what Western psychologists refer to as empathy, is this feeling of unbearableness of others' suffering. But that is thought to arise from this Yong. So in these practices, some of the key mental states that are cultivated and their opposing forces are these. Upeksha, equanimity, is supposed to overcome prejudices based on discriminations. Joy in others' happiness is supposed to help you deal with jealousy and envy. And recognition of shared disposition and of interconnected nature of welfare of self and others is supposed to help you overcome a sense of separation and alienation from others and conception of oneself as a discrete independent agent. And loving kindness is supposed to help you deal with hatred, and compassion is supposed to help you overcome self-centeredness and self-absorption. And often in the Buddhist text, the metaphor of farming is used, because you can see that in 2,500 years ago, India was, agriculture was the most important part of the economic activity. So many classical Indian Buddhist texts tend to be dominated by the metaphor of agriculture or commerce. So here, and then this is a beautiful metaphor that is used in the field of equanimity, and with loving kindness as the moisture, and the seed of compassion is nurtured. So this is, you can see how they are kind of conceptualized. To conclude, I will just list some of the key terms that come up in these practices. So you have a sense of concern or caring, which is thought to be a very basic natural mental state. So this is anukampa, or sympathy in its very basic state, and sometimes translated as sympathy, although I'm not sure if that's the right term. I would rather go for a sense of concern. And then holding the other as dear, that's the Yong that I was talking about, and literally means appealing to one's mind, and often referred to by its full name, which is love that holds the other as dear. I mean, that's a bit of a mouthful, of course. And then you have the kind of the Buddhist equivalent of empathy, not exactly the same, unbearableness of others' suffering. So that's somewhat kind of corresponds to the concept of empathy. And then you have equality or equanimity, and then recognition of the interconnectedness of self and others' welfare. Then you have gratitude. This is thought to be a very important part of the practice, so that you relate to others not as a source of antagonism or rivalry, but rather with a kind of a mental attitude of gratitude and appreciation. Then joy, particularly in others' happiness, this is thought to be very important, so that you are able to take joy in others' happiness. Then loving kindness is maitri, and compassion is karuna. And altruism is a tricky term in Buddhism. There are two terms which is used. Shempen is the non-technical term, and Shempen literally means helping others. Acts that are beneficial to others. So this is in its non-technical sense. But laksam is in the technical sense. And in brief, in Buddhism, not much distinction is made between compassion and altruism. Rather, altruism is seen as the more active form of compassion, where compassion can be a wish, based on a sense of concern for others' suffering and wanting that person to be relieved from suffering. And altruism would be a more active form of that compassion, where the person wants to do something, and may actually do something. So conceptually, not much distinction is made between compassion and altruism. They're more of a kind of a intensity, and whether or not the active personal commitment component is present or absent. So I just wanted to throw these out, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
I Yong
You.
I hold you dear. Go ahead.
In directly comparing these two talks, I got the sense that in the Christian tradition there is a very large emphasis on the actual acting, whereas in the Buddhist tradition there's a lot of talk about sensing somebody else's feelings and states. So where exactly does the action come in?
Well, that's a very good question. In Buddhism, there is, even if you look at Buddhist ethics, and if you compare that to other systems of ethical thinking, there's a very important assumption made in Buddhism, where the idea is that the emphasis should be on the development of the character. So it's kind of, in that sense, Aristotelian, somewhat similar kind of virtue type ethics. And the idea is that if you develop the character, and if you prime it to be responsive in a certain way, then when you're confronted with the situation, the act will come out naturally. So that may be a big assumption to make, but that really is, and so much of the compassion training is really aimed at making your heart responsive. I mean, we use language like, moistening your heart, opening it, or making it tender, and that sort of thing. And the idea is to kind of keep you responsive so that when the situation calls for it, you will act spontaneously.
As psychologists, we know how big the gap between intention and action very
Yeah.
often is.
Well, it's not just a question of intention, because intention is will. But through cultivation of the practice, it needs to go to this habit level so that your natural action will become the responsible one.
Thank you for this great talk. I really learned a lot. It's really great. And this new concept for me, Yong, just to understand it really, for me it feels very close to the practice of loving kindness, where you also develop the other as a loving deer. You imagine this other
Sure.
person, you pour out
Sure.
love. How do they actually differ in the real practice? Like, what is the...
Well, in practice, the loving kindness practice in the four immeasurables, you are wishing the other person to be happy. So, and this is part of the problem of using the same term maitre, loving kindness, in two different senses. So this Yong is sometimes also referred to as loving kindness.
Okay.
But loving kindness is also generally referred to, you have compassion focusing on others' suffering, relieving of others' suffering, and loving kindness focusing on wishing others happiness. So that loving kindness is different from Yong, because Yong is cultivating the sense of holding the other person as dear, and primarily on the basis of this concern. But it's more like a kind of a basis for the loving kindness, yeah.
Jimpala, thank you for a beautiful talk. One of the questions which students of emotion, I think, would want to ask about this kind of scheme is the extent to which all of these different states that you differentiate are really differentiable. So the extent to which they are orthogonal, independent, the extent to which they are overlapping or related. And a related question is the extent to which cultivating one will bring along the others. And yet another related question is whether there are different paths in, if you will, for the cultivation of this, the whole gestalt, if you will, and whether there are significant individual differences that may lead one person to be more responsive to cultivating one type of quality
Sure.
compared to others, and how do we begin to get at that?
There's a lot packed in that question. As I said in my opening remarks, Buddhist tradition also has a long history of critical reflection on the content of the meditative states and how they interrelate to each other. So in that sense, to respond to the first part of your question, there is an understanding of these different cognitive and affective states as having kind of, different distinct characteristics which make them individually identifiable and distinct aspects of mind. So in that sense, for example, if you look at the Buddhist taxonomy of various mental states, the definition of many of these mental states are really based on distinct functions they perform and the different effects they have. So in principle, yes, they should be distinct enough to be able to distinguish. But in response to your question about cultivation, given that we are, this discourse is taken within the scientific environment where whatever practices that is put on offer on table needs to be completely universal and secular, I did not talk about a very influential and probably the most dominant form of compassion cultivation practice, which is in the Tibetan tradition, recognition of all beings as having been your mother or child. Now that of course requires kind of a buying into the notion of infinite lifetimes and so on, and that is a very powerful practice, because the idea is that if you can view your enemy as having been your mother, and there are some beautiful texts, once that is done, then the task is fairly easy. Then the rest is all, depends upon how vivid your imagination is. I mean, some of the texts are beautiful in their description of how this person whom you dislike, who has been causing you so much trouble in this life, has in the past been your mother, has done this and X, Y, and Z. I mean, in such graphic details, and really kind of makes your heart very responsive to that person. So that's one. And for majority of the Tibetans, that's the standard compassion and cultivation practice, and recognition of others as mother, and reflecting upon their kindness and being grateful takes you to this Yong state, and then compassion arises. But then there are also more devotional approaches, where chanting, and then of course majority of the Tibetans will be very familiar with the kind of mythology of the Buddha of compassion. There's a beautiful story of why one of the manifestations of Buddha of compassion has 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes and 11 head, and these are all very powerful. And this is the strength of many religious traditions. Parables and anecdotes are very effective. So for many Buddhists, that approach of devotional path is also an effective.
John Dunne is our next speaker. He works on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, and his work is at the interface of Buddhism and science. This is often facilitated through his activities in the Mind and Life Institute, where he serves on the board of directors. And so we're very pleased to have you, John.
So Jimbala has asked me to say something a little bit more theoretical about the background of the practices and some of the Buddhist theoretical knowledge about how some of the practices might work and affect change in an individual. So that's what I will be focusing on. I wanted to give you a quick outline, somewhat uncharacteristically, and I emphasize quick. I was prepared to speak for 25 to 30 minutes, but I'm going to try to cut it a little bit short. Fortunately, Tanya gave me a cup of coffee out of great compassion, so I'm sure I can go fast enough. First of all, I want to make some remarks on method. Look at the Buddhist model of cognition and concept formation, and then look at this notion of mental facets and their role. Then talk about a particular style of meditation that we can call conceptual meditation, and how, in theory, it causes transformations in an individual, and then conclude with some implications. So in terms of method, as Bill mentioned, I work with the Mind and Life Institute a fair amount, and I've been privileged to be involved in a number of dialogues with Buddhists and scientists. And I think that it's important for us to occasionally step back and assess the cultural implications of that dialogue, and to raise a few cautionary tales, if you will, or at least pay attention to some issues that come up. And one of them is that as we give our presentations on Buddhism, and I'm sure Jimbala would agree with me, it's important for you all to realize that the Buddhist accounts are not unified. That is to say, there's a lot of variation within even single traditions, leave alone across traditions. And this also means that when we look at the particular sources we're drawing on, we're giving particular interpretations. So my sources are going to be into Tibetan texts and the traditions and oral traditions that are based upon those texts. Another important issue is that actual practices do not necessarily conform with theoretical or textual accounts. It's simply not the case that if you read something in a Buddhist text, that's what somebody actually does on the cushion. And it's also not necessarily the case if you read a Buddhist theory that if you ask then a Buddhist meditation teacher, well, how does this affect transformation in an individual, you might get a different response. So it's just very important to recognize that the tradition is pluralistic in this fashion. And finally, as is implied by the last statement, Buddhist texts are not the only or even principal, possibly source of information about contemplative practices. We're fortunate that we have a number of living contemplative Buddhist traditions, and these should be our main source. And therefore, I'm happy to know that there are some anthropologists, I think we have somebody here, who are becoming interested in the study of Buddhist contemplative practices per se. And really, unpacking these practices is a matter of us from an ethic or non-internal, if you will, perspective, examining what actually goes on in retreat contexts. And all of this might be a way of saying that Buddhism is not science, which I hope doesn't come as a shock. Although sometimes we seem to make it sound like science. Now, there are good reasons why it might sound a little bit like science, because the Buddhist traditions emphasize an empirical examination of the mind. And that examination is phenomenological in the sense that it means to give an account based upon a careful and highly trained observation of experience from a first-person perspective. Now, part of what this means is that the data on which Buddhist exegetes and theoreticians and philosophers are drawing, that data from which they are drawing is first-person data. It's not theory, it's collected in first-person experience. That does not mean that the only way it's analyzed is from the first-person standpoint. In a way that's very similar to the Husserlian phenomenological method, the mode of analysis involves third-person methodologies. It's just that the data is first-person. Those third-person methodologies we can think of in general terms as intersubjective correlation and verification. So what drives all of that? In principle, what's driving it is this data. And that observation, therefore, Buddhism is empirical in the sense that observation is meant to, in principle, trump other forms of evidence. As we know, even in science, as Thomas Kuhn has demonstrated, this is not necessarily always the case. But in principle, observation should trump other forms of evidence. So as I present some of this material to you today, I hope that you will see some of these features of Buddhism coming through, while at the same time recognizing that this is not exactly a scientific tradition, an issue that we could talk more about later. One other methodological concern, or maybe principle I'd like to set out right at the outset, is a kind of axiom in the context of Buddhist contemplative practices, which is that the main criterion for success is behavioral change. So you may read quite a lot in Buddhist texts and in popular literature about Buddhism concerning the wondrous internal experiences that might be induced by particular types of meditative states, and the intense emotional states that might also be induced. But from the traditional standpoint, although it's hard to pin this down textually, but certainly in terms of the oral tradition, the marker of success is what in Tibetan would be called kuncha, or your behavior. And if that is not altered, then no matter what one might claim in self-report, that self-report will be taken with quite a lot of salt. At the same time, self-report does matter. And there is an interplay between what is happening in terms of what's observable in terms of the individual's behavior for a teacher, and also what the individual is reporting in terms of their own first-person experience. And there's an important interplay both in terms of how these theories are developed and how practices are actually worked on the ground. Now let's take a quick look at the model of cognition and concept formation. Some of you are familiar with this already, I think. Basically, what we're dealing with here is a causal model of consciousness. Remember, this is developed phenomenologically. So this is based upon first-person data. Given what you can observe about what your own experience, what kind of an account of experience would you give? Again, that data then is interpreted using a type of empirical inference, and what the Buddhist theoreticians several centuries arrived at is this causal model of consciousness, where consciousness is discrete moments of time, accessible consciousness is discrete moments of time, discrete moments flowing through time, each causally conditioning the other. Now, if we take what we have here is one moment of time that we've taken out of that diagram. This is just, we'll treat this as a moment of consciousness, right? Or just let that represent consciousness for the moment. A very basic model of perception in Buddhism, which is going to be relevant to understanding how meditative practices work, is that you have an object, and it interacts with the senses in such a way that it produces what's called a phenomenal form, or akara, or nampa, in cognition. So again, this is a phenomenal account of how perception works. If we then, let's take that and actually move it now into a more complicated diagram, where we have time here, and then we're going to have three entities flowing through time. One is the object, one is the sense faculty, and one is consciousness itself. And as these flow through time, in the first time, the object interacts with the sense faculty. In a subsequent moment, what we get is the arisal of this phenomenal form. Now, we've added an extra detail here, which is that phenomenal form, by the way, in terms of its appearance, in terms of the way it presents itself phenomenally, is not a mirror of the object, as was pointed out in the reading that Thupten Jinpa supplied for you. It's not mirroring the object, and this diagram is somewhat confusing in that way. It is already conditioned, as we will, and I will say a little bit more about that. It is conditioned by affective states, it's conditioned by the state of the body, and so on. At the same time, it's very important to note that as that phenomenal form of the object arises, at the same time a sense of subjectivity arises. So you have a sense of subjectivity and a phenomenal form of the object arising simultaneously. They actually create each other in a certain way. That sense of subjectivity is not actually a witness of the object. Strictly speaking, it is simply arising with the object as part of what is in fact a seamless experience. Now, as this object flows through time, or rather in a subsequent moment, then this sense impression, this phenomenal form that's produced through the action of the senses, can then be conceptualized, and that's indicated by these quotation marks. And that act of conceptualization now renders that accessible to ordinary consciousness. For most ordinary persons, this level is not accessible. The claim here is that it can be accessed in first-person experience with adequate training, but that for most persons, that level is not accessible. What is accessible is the conceptualized phenomenal form. And there's a complex conceptual process in Buddhism, in this form of Buddhist theory, called apoha, or exclusion, in which the conceptualization, in effect, relies upon a kind of negation. The object, it's not actually a creation of similarity, it's a creation of difference, such that objects are identified as the same on the basis of this creation of difference. Phenomenal form is called non-conceptual. That means it has not gone through this process that differentiates it from other things so as to create a similarity or a set of things that are similar. In the next moment, in what's marked as time 3 here, when the conceptualization process has occurred, this is now called conceptual. And the Buddhist notion of concepts is such that even pigeons use concepts. And some of you are probably familiar with some of this research, some of it starting as early as, I think, 1964, on the ability of pigeons to recognize characters in pictures and postcards and so on. My favorite example is the ability to recognize Charlie Brown. Clearly, there's no evolutionary need for pigeons to recognize Charlie Brown, and yet they do. Even when Charlie Brown is sliced up and diced up and put in strange situations, they can reliably, to a very high degree of correlation, as I recall, recognize Charlie Brown in pictures. What this means is that they're taking this kind of a sense datum, they're taking this sense datum here, this phenomenal form, and they are, obviously pre-consciously, they are massaging it, so to speak. It is going through this process of conceptualization such that now they are able to recognize two things as the same, a repeated image of Charlie Brown. So that's the basic model. Now, part of this model also involves conditioning. There's, of course, physical conditioning, the nature of your sense faculties. There's preconceptual conditioning, the kind of conditioning that goes into the production of the non-conceptual, the perceptual phenomenal form, and then conceptual conditioning. And at the same time, there is what we might call gunk flowing through the system. And that's all of this stuff that is coming down through our histories. And the technical Buddhist term for that would be, among other terms, karma, actually. This is the kind of conditioning that is flowing down in one's mind, and that is having that is what guarantees that this phenomenal form is not a mirror of this, because this phenomenal form is highly conditioned by whatever gunk is flowing through the system. Some of that gunk is going to have a preconceptual effect, and some of it is going to have a conceptual effect. But in any case, it has a very strong effect on both the preconceptual phenomenal form and the conceptual phenomenal form. Now, Some features of this of concept formation are relevant here when we look a little bit more closely at this notion of gunk. Is first of all that all concept formation occurs in the context of goals, implicit or explicit. That is to say that one major form of conditioning in the context of concept formation is what it is that one wants and what it is that one does not want. In fact, the theoretician Dunne, who initially developed this model, maintains that all concepts are formed either in terms of obtaining the desirable, avoiding the undesirable, or ignoring the irrelevant. And this frame, this what you might even call teleological frame, very short term sometimes, teleological frame, is the basis for the formation of all concepts. In addition to innate structures that are required for concept formation, which account for the creation of similarity, just note here that the Buddhist position is nominalist, so that means that there are in fact no two similar entities in the world at all. Two coffee glasses or water glasses that appear to be identical, in fact, are not identical in any way at all, and whatever similarity we see in them is being supplied through our cognitive and conceptual processes. So that similarity if we're creating similarity on our own side, what that means is you have to have some innate structures which account for this capacity to create similarity. And those innate structures are critical, obviously, for this theory of concept formation. But concept formation also critically depends upon associations formed through previous experience. And the implication here seems to be something like a notion also of reward, which in short means that the associations that are impacted upon one when one is learning concepts or when concepts are changing for one, that the process in which that change occurs involves some kind of reward. Success, in other words. When it forms an initial association that leads to success, one obtains what one wants or avoids what one doesn't want, and that success then encourages or solidifies this association. That seems to be Dharmakirti's notion of this theory. The other issue that I've also implied is that not only is this the level of consciousness that is accessible to ordinary persons for the most part, except in extraordinary circumstances, it's also the case that concepts drive all deliberate action. So it would have to be the case that the man who jumps into the water had a concept, unless he fell by mistake. So when one is engaged even in heroic compassion, there is some kind of minimal conceptual structure operative. Now let me just move on here to this question of mental facets and their role. So every mental event on this model includes both the sheer apprehension of an object and other features or mental facets. And these mental facets have to do with the cognitive features of an event. Others are more affective, but both types contribute to all events. An important note, they are not categorized as either cognitive or affective. So the categorization of a distinction between mental facets that are cognitive or affective does not exist in Buddhism, which helps to explain also why there is no word for emotion in the Buddhist technical vocabulary. There have been some recent attempts to coin a term for emotion, but there are no terms for emotions for the word emotion in the Buddhist technical vocabulary. Now, these mental facets are occurring in the context of that same stream of mental moments. And if we take out one mental moment and look at it for a second, there are 5 mental facets that occur with every single mental moment. And again, this is going to be based on a phenomenological investigation, I remind you. So from a phenomenological perspective, every mental moment involves these 5. And you'll note, I won't go into them in detail, most of them have to do with features of attention, but one in particular here, feeling tone, is really more of an affective feature. And that has to do with whether or not the sensation, that moment of consciousness, is presented subjectively as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Another 5 are involved in the kind of cognition that enables one to discern an object more clearly. And this is the kind of the more of these that are present, the greater and more accurate will be the report on the object. The intensity of them will also relate to the accuracy of the report on the object, of the capacity to form a concept, a useful concept of the object. And these are, again, I'm not going to go into great detail, interest is a critical one in the context of meditation. It said that these are the ones, by the way, that are cultivated in meditative practice, I should add. So concentration and discernment, samadhi and prajna, are meant to be the endpoints of many Buddhist meditation practices. However, what they often require is a kind of stability of mind, and that stability of mind comes from cultivating initially another factor, which in Pali is called sati, in Sanskrit is called smrti, and has been very confusingly translated as mindfulness. And a few of us are trying to suggest a different translation of retention. And this is the capacity. What this means is that phenomenally, in this moment of mind, does not feel like in the next moment of mind you will lose the object. That is probably the best description of it in phenomenal terms. And so this capacity to retain the objects is what is initially cultivated in most Buddhist meditative practices, formal practices. Interest is critical, however, and is said to be the most important because interest is what connects one to a particular goal. And it's that connection to a particular goal that also is going to regulate which concepts are going to be formed. Since all concepts are formed in relationship to what one wishes to obtain or one wishes to avoid, fixing the goal, fixing the orientation, the intention, the motivation at the beginning of a session of contemplative practice is considered to be critical for the success of that session. Now, along with these can come a number of other possible facets, and any moment of mind could have any of a number of other facets. And there are actually different lists of these facets. The facets are meant to be atomic in the sense that they are irreducible. But there are different lists of these allegedly irreducible facets of mind. And so there's some disagreement even within single traditions in Buddhism. But interestingly, the general categorization that we encounter in terms of talking about facets is not cognitive and affective, but rather virtuous and non-virtuous. And when we look at the difference between what is a virtuous or non-virtuous facet, a virtuous facet has, one of the ways this difference is determined is in terms of outcome. In other words, speaking in terms of virtue theory, is this creating the virtues that would lead to the good life, or is it doing the opposite? Are these facets disturbing? In other words, is the state of mind in which the facets arise one that is stable? Or could it be stable? Or is the facet in and of itself, by its very nature, contrary to any kind of stability of mind, clarity of mind, and so on? Does it have a tendency to block or allow other states? And what you could say in this regard is taking the Sanskrit term for these states, the negative states, the Sanskrit term is klesha, which literally means sticky. So you could say that non-virtuous states are in some sense sticky. They inhibit other facets from arising. Virtuous states, in contrast, are much more flexible. And finally, a major question, a major way of distinguishing the two is, and this reminds me of some of what Wendy was saying in her talk, is the question of the degree of cognitive distortion. In general, virtuous states are compatible with, they don't necessarily arise without cognitive distortion, but they are compatible with completely undistorted cognitions. Non-virtuous states necessarily distort their objects, which is to say, non-virtuous states necessarily attribute qualities to their objects that the objects do not have. The question of disturbance, I won't read out the quote to you, but this is a quote from the Abhidharma Samuccaya of Asanga, which is speaking about the notion that non-virtuous states or afflicted states are disturbing. The idea of it being sticky, I like this quote by the great Tibetan philosopher practitioner Tsongkhapa, who says, attachment focuses on an external or internal object that is beautiful and attractive and then craves it. And just as it is difficult to remove grease that is soaked into a cotton cloth, likewise it is difficult to stop attending to an object that one yearns for and is fixated on. So this is part of this notion that these states are states that inhibit the arisal of other facets, especially their opposites. Every one of the states in fact, is considered to have, or I should say, every one of the non-virtuous states is considered to have something that is translated into Tibetan as nyambo, or in Sanskrit it is pratipaksha. This means antidote. So all of the sticky states can actually be deliberately dislodged by the deliberate cultivation of a virtuous state that is its opposite. But without that deliberate dislodgement, these states can persist for a considerable period of time. Now, when we think about the effect of these different kinds of states, obviously, if you have a very sticky state, so to speak, and we're dealing with multiple streams of multiple mental moments, a very sticky state is going to place limits on the possible interpretation of this object. Recall that possible interpretations of this phenomenal form. So we see a flower, it creates an impression, and then I interpret this impression. If I have craving or attachment for that flower, the range of interpretations that I might give to that flower is going to be limited by that craving or attachment. Whereas if I have a state that does not necessarily imply that the flower has to be obtained, unlike craving, then I have a wider range of interpretations. On the other hand, if I dislike the flower, if I find it ugly and I want to get rid of it, similarly, my range of interpretations is going to be limited by that particular affective state that is conditioning the arisal, actually even of the preconceptual phenomenal form, but especially of the conceptual phenomenal form. Let me just move on somewhat quickly again to conceptual meditation and transformation, and see how this theory can be brought into the context of meditative practice. When we speak about conceptual meditation, it presumes, first of all, a certain degree of training. Now, that training does not actually have to be formal. It can be quite formal. It can involve a great deal of study of logic, a great deal of study of technical material within Buddhism, but it can also involve the formation of concepts, and remember here we're talking about the kind of concepts that pigeons have, that are not so elaborate, actually. And hence the recitation of a mantra such as Om Mani Padme Hum would count as a kind of concept training that, although it's not philosophical, is nevertheless creating a type of stability in the concept. And when the concepts are what are called dhrida, or stable in Sanskrit, then it is possible to apply certain types of contemplative techniques to induce states that have the visceral impact of perceptions. Now, the claim here, if we just go back for a moment to this diagram, the claim here is that, as we noted before, associations seem to be confirmed or made, they're made more stable, they are ingrained. Associations of concepts with particular types of sense impressions are ingrained by success. And success would be constituted by the arisal of another sense impression that constitutes what I want. So I see something that I have a concept for, I call it fire. I want to be warm. That thing creates an impression, I call it fire. I walk over to it, I get a new impression, and it feels warm. So that previous concept of fire has been reinforced by experience. Now the problem is that, of course, this can work in either direction toward the creation of virtues or the creation of more vices, as it were. Especially with sticky states, this is the reason that why the non-virtuous states are so problematic, is that they seem to constantly be producing reward, because you do actually get confirmation in terms of the interpretation that the state is providing for you. So one way of harnessing this feature of the mind, according to this Buddhist theory, is to actually take concepts, make them stable, and try to induce something like a perceptual state on the concept. And these states have a much stronger transformative impact in just thinking about concepts in a less focused fashion. And again, this can be done in a very formal context, in which the theory, this is coming out of Dharmakirti's theory of yogi prachaksha, or Nenjong Ngunsum. In the formal context would be the study of philosophy, concentration, for example, on the concept of impermanence, and then by focusing on this concept of impermanence repeatedly, one actually, in a sense, hallucinates it. And Dharmakirti uses the example of a lover who hallucinates the presence of his beloved. Likewise, one can hallucinate this concept. The concept is not real. There is no such thing as impermanence in the world. We have to form that, or we have to construct it internally, but it's very therapeutically useful. So that would be a very formal way of engaging in this type of practice. An informal way, however, would be something like mantra repetition, where one is ingraining, making very stable what is in effect a concept, the mantra itself. There are a set of associations with that mantra. And then one would concentrate on it to such an extent that eventually perhaps one might have some kind of a visceral, immediate experience that is associated with the concept. Now, the way this works theoretically, as you know, we're flowing through time here, right? So let's say in the formal context, we see a glass, and Jimpa, being the great Buddhist philosopher that he is, sees the glass and immediately interprets it conceptually as impermanent, as momentary, as changing every moment. And then if he chose to, he could take that concept of impermanence and focus on it in meditation repeatedly. Now, even just the concept itself, certain types of concepts are said to be therapeutic. For example, as I mentioned earlier, there are the antidotes. And Jimpa also had some of these on his slide. If one is experiencing anger, even the concept of loving kindness acts as an antidote to that anger. So there will be effects on both conceptual and preconceptual conditioning just from the concept itself. But if through repeated practice, which is represented by the long time frame here, one eventually induces something like a perceptual state, not a conceptual state, but a non-conceptual apprehension of the concept itself, then that has a much stronger impact on one's conditioning, and it is said to even affect one's physical conditioning. Now, this model of practice is one that obviously can be applied in many different contexts, but certainly it is the model of practice that's being applied in the context of generating compassion. The compassion practices are highly conceptual. They do not involve, there are, however, I should note, non-dual traditions who would say that the conceptual practices can be useful, but in the end, what one wishes to do is to eliminate all concepts, and then compassion will spontaneously arise. But in the style of practices that we're speaking about today, one is actually using conceptual methods in order to induce an effective state. And those conceptual methods, when they gain a certain degree of stability, can become, with the right kind of training, and there are a number of techniques that are involved here, especially in the formal context, but with the right kind of training, they can have a much stronger impact than simply thinking about a concept. So one of the issues here, of course, is can sustained but not perceptual experience of transformative concepts have a significant, if diminished, effect on behavior? The Buddhist model seems to imply its endpoint is what's called yogi prachaksha, yogic perception, where one is directly intuiting the concept. But even if we don't reach that point of having something like a direct visceral experience of impermanence, for example, is there still some kind of impact from repeated training on a particular stable concept that would be different from thinking about concepts in a more general way? In other words, can we harness some of these techniques in a much more short-term fashion? Second, these states have a much stronger transformative impact than thinking about concepts in a less focused fashion. So becoming unstuck can be achieved through the induction of effective antidotes using these techniques. And that's the principle that's guiding this theory of meditative practice. Let me just raise a couple of very limited conclusions. One of them is that what we've seen is that the limits on cognitive capacities and flexibility are primarily dependent on affective facets of mind. This is a key issue in Buddhist theory. In other words, reaching the highest level of cognitive capacity requires an effective adjustment. And this part of the reason for this, in terms of Buddhist theory of concept formation, is that affect is regulating goals, and goals are regulating concept formation. I want something. That wanting places limits on my interpretations of my experience, and therefore that wanting is limiting me cognitively. On the other hand, there are kinds of affective states that are much more open. And here I'm thinking, I read recently something by Barbara Fredrickson on her theory of positive mental states. And she makes the point basically that some positive mental states seem to lead to a wider focus of attention. And I think she may actually have something there that corresponds or that has some kind of similarity to Buddhist notions. Second, conceptual schema that induce virtuous affective facets amenable to particular goals, or at least as important as other features of meditative practice. All that means is concepts are very important from this point of view, especially when we think of concepts in this very minimal pigeon-like way, if you will. And finally, the cultivation of at least some states and traits may not require extensive training in attention-based techniques. That if we're looking for, if we are looking to harness the power of compassion practices, it might be a mistake to think that we need to sit people on the cushion and teach them something that these days we call shamatha. That might be quite a big mistake, actually. In fact, as Jimpa has pointed out, the majority of Buddhists in the world don't do that. And yet they may very well have benefited from this form of training. Thanks very much.
All right, so I'm obligated to ask you to unpack your final few words regarding given I'm so the other, but I also wanted to ask you that you used the term undistorted.
Yes.
In a framework that seemed to imply there could be no undistorted because of gong karma and the inherent never identity between mental representation.
So very quickly, undistorted in this context means not attributing qualities to an object that the quality does not have. So that whatever concept is formed, that the concept is not imputing qualities to that object that it does not have. And specifically in this context, what that means is that it's not imputing functions to the object that the object actually could not perform. Like I might think the Ferrari is going to make me eternally happy, and when I see the Ferrari, I have a concept of the Ferrari which includes its capacity to make me eternally happy, and it can't do that.
Okay, so let's go back to the first question.
Okay. In short, I think that what we find is that in the actual, if we look at the actual techniques and what the actual practices on the ground are, an empirical question would be, are they practices that are done by lay people inducing something like a trait of compassion, a compassionate trait, some kind of compassionate traits? That's one empirical question. Second question, looking at the majority of practitioners in most of the Buddhist monasteries, they are not engaged in extensive practice of something like shamatha. They are engaged very often in extensive practice of the type of practice that Jimpa described. Is it the case, again empirically, that they also there are some measurable traits that we could detect there, and that those traits are not coming through any kind of really formal attention-based training?
Right. So that to me sounds like an empirical question.
Exactly, and that's why I'm putting it up there as a possible conclusion. Richie, quickly.
John, I love your criterion for success of contemplative practices, behavioral change. One of the things that many people around this table, the scientists, are perennially in search of in this domain is good markers of behavioral change. Please tell us what your top 3 might be.
You have a suggestion? I would actually say, I think they're also in the Christian tradition. It would be very interesting to get some reflections from this on the Christian tradition. I would say that in terms of behavioral change, I think, in fact, and Paul is not here anymore, but quite possibly one of the major manifestations, and I'm not going to say I'm a very bad practitioner, by the way, would be a facial expression, actually. My conversations with Buddhist teachers...
Holiness has questioned that.
Yeah, I'm sure that, the accuracy, I'm not saying that there isn't an accuracy of, I'm not saying that the way that it's mapped perfectly onto emotions, that's not what I mean. But that there will be a teacher, my experience, this is not traditional, by the way, but my experience with meditation teachers is that they observe very closely the eyes and this part of the face very closely when they're doing interviews. I've been interviewed myself, and I've also observed interviews. And it seems to me that they ask very probing questions, sometimes that are deliberately look like they're trying to induce a negative state. And they seem to be looking for facial reactions. So I think actually one of the signs here they're looking for is, they're looking for external signs of of negative emotions. That's one of the keys. I also think, interestingly, that one of the changes that often they look for is, and this is a little bit harder to express, but actually a sort of a lack of tension in the voice, in the movements, a fluidity of movement and voice. So someone who starts like this and then it ends up like this, they're going in the wrong direction. Right? But if they start like this, then so these are really non-traditional ways of trying, because in fact the text, I don't know, in the tradition, then we can talk about the standard avoiding the 10 non-virtues and so on. But in the text, they don't really give a lot of detail on this. Maybe you have something.
I mean, one way of looking at it is that there is a kind of implicit interconnection made between recognition of interconnectedness as a kind of a cognitive perspective, and compassion as an affective state, and cooperative behavior as a kind of a behavioral expression. So I think someone who's compassionate towards the other person is going to be much more willing to do something, and that probably is. But in the text, there are, for example, the arising of great compassion, which is the sentient compassion that Paul Ekman is talking about, is really seen as the mark of having, to use Buddhist technical language, awakened the Buddha nature. So that really is seen as the mark of having awakened the Buddha nature. And then the question is asked, what are the internal and external signs of this happening? And then the external signs are when you're confronted with the suffering of another person, the goosebumps arise, tears flow down naturally, and you respond. So there are very clear physical kind of indications mentioned in the text.
And I should say another textual one is also that others react to that person in a way that involves sometimes great familiarity and a sense of attraction.
Yeah.
Another external.
In fact, one of the great kind of attributes of the Buddha is I don't know how you translate this, Matiba Zashechimbu, the great friend to someone who is unknown, unfamiliar, and someone who does good to others regardless of what the other has done, harm or benefit. So these are kind of indirect ways of suggesting what kind of behavior, and also the ability to see particularly enemy as a spiritual teacher. And there are all these things which I'm sure if we sit down and look at, there might be a way of teasing out, but it needs a little bit of work.
Scotty is the dean of our chapel and is a good friend and a very thoughtful man, and himself has had very nice interactions with the Dalai Lama. Scotty, please come.
I'd like to explore a little bit more, because this seems to be the session to do it, the definitional differences between love in the Christian tradition and compassion in the Buddhist tradition. And I want to do it rather anecdotally by looking at a book that I teach. I teach a lot of literature in courses here at Stanford. But the book by Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, that was actually published in 1922. He was born in 1877 to a family of Christian missionaries and religious publishers, and his family expected him to follow in that tradition, and he went to theology school, but then went in quite a different direction, went to India, was very influenced and became very interested in Buddhism, and then published Siddhartha after years of study of Buddhism at the age of 45. And in this book, you have Siddhartha on his own quest. He has a friend named Govinda. This takes place supposedly around 500 BC at the time of the historical Buddha. Siddhartha is not the Buddha, but he's on his own. He actually meets the historical Buddha, but he keeps striving for enlightenment on his own, while his friend Govinda is in fact a disciple of the Buddha. Siddhartha keeps talking about love being for ordinary people, not a master like he is trying to be. It leads to attachment, which blocks the path to enlightenment. And instead, he aspires to, I think, what Jinpa has called the great compassion, the profound empathy for all sentient beings. And he talks about the consciousness of the stream of all life, which, when one is in harmony with it, gives one compassion. And that's possible during deep meditation, where time is dispelled and everything becomes good. I don't have time to go through a lot more of what he says about that, but near the end of the book, he seems to make a switch. And he says to his friend Govinda that it seems to me that love is the most important thing in the world. And maybe we have Hesse here struggling with his Christian and Buddhist backgrounds. And he's come out of an experience of intense love for his son, who he has encountered late in his life, didn't know early in his life. And Govinda responds, that's what the illustrious one, the Buddha, called illusion. He preached benevolence and forbearance and sympathy and patience, but not love. He forbade ourselves to bind ourselves to earthly love. And in the way love comes across in the book, it's heartfelt, it's subjective, it's full of pathos, emotional response, well beyond what the way Siddhartha keeps coming across as being more cool and distancing and objective and rational, almost intellectual in his values of benevolence and compassion. And he does experience, though, these very rich, powerful feelings of love with his son, utter devotion when they're together, a wounded heart at the time of separation, and so on. And so this whole distinction, I think when I teach this to students, they're always struggling with this. Is compassion for all sentient beings something that has a kind of cool impersonality about it? And what about the intensity of love and how important that is, starting with the familial, obviously, and expanding from there. Second point I'd like to make has been made well, Wendy certainly did, in terms of how Christianity cultivates and expresses this notion of love and has a strong prophetic tradition, going back, of course, to the Hebrew scriptures, not just meditation and prayer, although she gave some good examples of that, but action. And therefore we have, for example, the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew scriptures saying, even though you make many prayers, or meditation, however you want to read that, I will not listen. That's what God is saying. Learn to do good and seek justice and rescue the oppressed and defend the orphan and plead for the widow. And so it's this, and Micah, another of the prophets, says, how shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And again, as you cited the Matthew 25, Jesus in that tradition talking about, I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was naked and you clothed me, and I was a stranger and you welcomed me, and I was in prison, etc. So this is not to say, because I know Buddhism has had a strong tradition in this area as well of what was described by Jinpa as active compassion and helping others. There's engaged Buddhism and its effect that we've seen in recent decades. But, and of course, Christianity has a strong contemplative tradition as well. But there may be an important difference there between those two traditions that's worth looking at. Finally, a mention of the area of forgiveness. Christians make a lot of the connection between compassion and love and forgiveness. And at Stanford here, we have a forgiveness project that was founded by Dr. Fred Luskin. And he has written a variety of books, including Forgive for Good, Forgive for Love, and talks about how people harboring resentment for others is so debilitating to them as individuals, and that he feels forgiveness is often misunderstood, he says, by church sermons and people like me, but it to him is primarily a matter of letting go of one's own anger and sadness and other emotions, but not about the other. It doesn't, he tries to distinguish one's own healing and the importance of that and how forgiveness has actual physical results in terms of heart rate and stress reduction, a variety of other things. But it's not about the other, it's about the self. So to think of, so much obviously of Buddhist practice and Christian as well is focusing on others' pain and suffering and having an aspiration for them to gain freedom from their pain and suffering. But this more modern claim, psychological claim about forgiveness and the research that he speaks about being behind it is one which is very much focused on self, and in a sense it doesn't matter what happens to that other person. It certainly doesn't matter whether they ever reciprocate the forgiveness that one feels. So just another area, I don't know if we'll ever get to forgiveness in this session, but it's an area of current interest to me.
Thank you, Scotty. We can hold on to those three questions for our general session because I think those all really deserve discussion, and especially because I think there's a much more credible link now between this Yong and this love, Christian love. Perhaps there's a middle ground there. Perhaps it's not quite as impersonal. A great compassion may not be impersonal after all. So anyway, we should explore that, but I know you want to send us to lunch and our working lunch. Thank you. Good to all the speakers.